What's up, Dreamhive community? Good to see you. My name is Galen. Welcome back to Art by Galen. Last video, I showed you how to do this sketch. And today in this video, I'm going to show you how to take that and turn it into this one. Today's video is going to focus on taking the sketch that we did in the last one of the Spellbook, and we're going to take it today, we're going to paint it, we're going to give it some depth and some realism and some textures and colors and stuff and have some fun with it. So come on over here with me and let's get started. If you haven't watched the last video where we did this sketch, there will be a link for that over in that general direction. But the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off the layers that have these stages, the basic book when we added the details and then we refined the details. I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to take these two layers that we've got. We had our refined sketch with shading, and then I did another darker color to further fine-tune the drawing. I'm going to merge these two. And I'm going to make a new layer underneath it. And I'm going to set this layer to multiply. And you'll see why I'm going to do this in just a minute. Move this up more towards the center of the canvas here. By the way, if you haven't already, or you didn't see it in the first video, you can download the paper texture that I'm using as a background here if you want to use that to draw along with some of the brushes that I use. There will be some links down below where you can get access to that stuff if you would like to. They're not required to do this artwork, obviously, but if you would like, they are there. So the first thing I'm going to do is behind this whole layer is I'm going to take a neutral gray color, maybe even a slightly blue tinted gray. I'm going to take like kind of a chalky brush, something like this. And this is one of the ones from Kyle's paint box, if you have any of Kyle brushes, which are amazing. But anyway, I'm just going to give us a gray background, something solid for us to use. And I'm just going to fill that in. And it's okay if the edges are rough. We actually kind of like that. I think that's pretty cool. And give it even some more chalkiness on some spots here. And then I'm going to lock that layer. We're going to make a new layer. Now I'm going to go back to my pencil brush and I'm going to keep it at a larger size here. And I'm going to choose kind of like a leathery color, like a medium brown or something like that. So yeah, something like this. And what I'm going to do, now you could do this painting it in full like I'm doing, or you could also, make a selection with the selection tool and just fill it if you like. But I like to do it by hand. That way I get, it keeps me looking at what I'm working on, and it makes me sort of focus on the details and things like that. And plus, I'm not a huge fan of using the selection tool because it doesn't always do the way that you want it to. Now we've got this one color. It looks like there's many tones, but let me show you why that's happening. It's actually just one color. I can see some of my gaps in here. I'm going to go ahead and fill in real quick as well. But because the sketch layer is set to multiply, all of the shading and like darknesses and stuff that are on it get applied to whatever color's underneath it. So even just by doing this, it already looks pretty good. But we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to get two other colors. We're going to choose a color for our paper. And for that, I'm going to go slightly more into the yellow or goldish kind of colors. And I'm going to choose a really kind of whitish, almost gray version of that. I think that's pretty good. Kind of a creamy color. Because we don't want it to be pure white with an older book like this. The paper really wouldn't have been bleached or anything. And so we're just going to color in these areas of the paper with that. And this is all on the same layer that we did the brown. Another trick that you can do if you're working digitally in Photoshop and in many other applications, you can lock the opacity of a layer, which means that whatever pixels are on that layer you can only draw within those. In Photoshop, you can do that by clicking this button right over here. And so what happens is now if I color outside of this layer, it doesn't show up. I can literally color only inside what's there. And that's pretty handy when you want to fill in quickly areas like this here. See, I can just scribble right off of the edge and it doesn't matter. However, when you're coloring in areas like this, you do still have to pay attention to your edges. Okay, so now the paper is done. I'm going to do the same thing with the metal. I'm not sure if I want to do silver or if I want to do like a brass or a gold. I think a brass might be kind of cool. Let's try that. So a base color for brass would be kind of a mid-orange, I think. Maybe a little bit brighter. Yeah, I think that'll work pretty well. So like a really pale, muted orange, like not overly saturated. You don't want it to be like the color of a fruit or a carrot or anything like that, because it wouldn't be quite that saturated. And again, this is just, if I take that line layer away, these are just solid colors I'm using. The shading is coming from our sketch. And here in a moment, once we get these base colors in, we will merge all of this together and we'll go from there. All right, so there's that, and we'll come in and do the same thing with the lock. Okay, so now we've got the base colors in, and this actually doesn't look too bad, even from just being solid colors, having some shading on them. However, I do want to take it a little bit farther. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this and I'm going to group it, and I'm going to duplicate that group so we have a copy of it that we can use just to show our stages, similar to how we did with our sketches. And so here, I'm going to take our sketch layer that's set to multiply. I'm going to play with bringing the opacity down a bit. I think something about 50% or so is pretty good. Now I can tell now that this sketch layer was actually giving us some of our color saturation because of it being slightly red or orange tinted. So I'm actually going to go back in my flat color layer and I'm going to boost up the saturation just a little bit, about like so, to give us some of those colors back. And now in Photoshop, if you're on a layer, there's a thing called clipping masks that you can use, where like we've got this sketch layer on top, but you see how it comes out of the edges, like it overlays the color that's underneath. And if you want to clip it to the color that's underneath, you can hold the Alt key and click on the line in between the layers, and it will actually, anything on this highlighted layer that you draw will be limited to what the pixels are in the layer underneath it, for instance. So like if I'm drawing inside it, it will stop if I try to draw outside of it. But the interesting thing is I can still come in and move it around and see all of it. But anyways, so I think we're going to clip it down. And some of the edges are pretty rough, but that's okay. We're going to come in and we're going to clean all of this up. Now, I try to keep this as close to, traditional art as I can. Obviously, traditional art, you don't really work in layers like this that you can manipulate individually. We're going to take the line work layer and the color layer, and we're going to merge those two layers together. And so now there's just one layer for the entire thing. I know that seems a little bit scary sometimes when you're doing digital art, keeping it just on one layer, but hang in there with me, okay? So the first thing we need to do is clean up some of these edges. I'm going to take my pencil brush that I was using earlier. I'm going to get a slightly smaller size for it. And I'm going to use my color picker and just grab a color from the brass that we had done. And I'm just going to kind of clean up the edges. I'm going to go through the whole piece and do this. And just kind of choosing colors based on what's around. Okay, so I've gone around the outside and cleaned things up. Oh, I see one little mistake here. Let's fix this. This doesn't really come out to the shape that it should. And this will happen. It's okay. You just make little adjustments as it goes on. I really want to challenge you. Don't be afraid to paint just on one layer or just a few layers, like a foreground and a background kind of thing. Yes, you might make mistakes. Matter of fact, you probably will make mistakes. But you have to believe in yourself that if you make a mistake and you have to paint over something, you did it once. That means you can do it again. And the more often that you do it, the more experience you get with what you're doing. Now we've got everything on one layer. We've got our edges cleaned up. It's probably safe at this point to lock our pixels because I don't think we'll need to add anything outside of what we've already drawn. And so everything that we draw now is going to be inside the pixels that are already there. I'm going to continue working on the same layer. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can absolutely work on a new layer above it and just use the clipping mask effect. Or leave it freehand if you would like to challenge yourself, however you'd like to do it. But the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start smoothing out some of this hatch work that we did in the sketch and start moving it into being more of a painting instead of a drawing. And that means we're going to be getting rid of some of these hatching lines that are in the paper, and we're going to start adding some basic shading to the overall piece. Yeah, first off, let's just smooth everything out, and I'm going to go into time-lapse while I do that. I'm just going to grab some of these colors and just start brushing them in here. And it might be a little messy, but that's okay. We also might cover up some of the lines that we made earlier, and that is also completely okay. So using the colors that were already here, I've gone in and smoothed out most of the textures that are in the sketch and started laying kind of what I would call the base colors for the painting. And I generally like to start off with the mid-tones. That means that whatever color that something is going to be, I try to start off somewhere in the middle. And the reason I like to do that is because it gives me the opportunity to go both darker and lighter with my colors and gives me what I feel to be a little bit more control over my work. So the same way we started with the shadows, let's start with the deepest area. If I color sample here, we can see it's in this kind of middle brown color. I'm going to take it a little bit darker and a little bit redder. And I'm going to start just brushing in some of the shadow in here. And I'm using a very large version of my pencil brush. I often paint with it because I just like the texture of it. And again, you can use whatever brush you're more comfortable with. And so what I'm doing, I'm just going through thinking about the areas that are going to get the most light. Like the top edges of everything are going to get the most. So that means that the sides would be relatively darker compared to the rest. So if I take a slightly darker brown, and I'm not pushing all the way. If I did, it would be very dark. I'm just going slightly darker on the edge here. You can see that we're establishing that edge. I'm going to darken it a little bit more on the bottom where that deeper shadow would be laying against whatever table or other books it might be on. Same thing over on this side. And then just kind of fading it upward as it comes up. And we're already starting to get some pretty good depth with this. Do the same thing on this top edge of the book cover. Just a little bit darker. And I'm going to fade it out back here into a lighter color because, I don't know, I'm a fan of having different ranges of values and stuff if you can. And I'm going to pull the darker shadows up into where the leather strap would overlap it. A slightly smaller brush, and I'm going to darken up that bottom edge of the leather strap. And then I'm going to darken up the side of the strap. You can see it's starting to come to life. Like those shadows really push down the deeper areas and really start to help give the book some depth. I want to focus on trying to finish up the leather first, and I think that I'm going to need a softer brush to work with this. Now I've got various skin brushes that I use, and I've also got some actual leather texture brushes that I have made myself, and really you can use pretty much any like airbrush kind of brush for this, anything with soft edges. And again, I'm going over the very outside. Let me show you what this does. It kind of rounds it off. You see without it, it looks like it goes to like kind of a flat edge almost. But if we darken up that edge as well, we're telling our viewer that the highest point is where that highlight hits. And that gives the indication that it does curve back down on the other side. So it's one of the reasons that we do little things like that. Now I'm going to take a larger version of that same brush, and I'm just going to brush on some darker texture, or darker colors rather, just to give us a little bit of range with the values here. Starting at one side, making big strokes. Like here, you'll notice it will be darker, and over here it will be very light. What I'm going to do is I just start here with bigger strokes, and as I move to the left, I am decreasing the pressure that I'm using with the brush, and that gives me a nice little fade. And it's okay that I'm overlapping the metal because we haven't painted the metal yet. We can fine tune all of that. It's not a problem at all. I'm going to do the same thing up top, but not quite as dark, and then same thing with the side of the leather strap here, getting really dark down at the bottom and fading it upward. Thinking about where the most light would hit. Now I'm going to go back to a slightly smaller soft brush, and I'm going to bring those shadows up to the edge of the strap here. Okay, we'll round off this back edge of the strap as well. And I'm going to fade it into slightly darker in the middle here near the buckle. And we'll do the same thing on the other side, but in reverse. We'll fade it right out to about the ridge here. Like, let me exaggerate. This is about where I want the highlight to be. So I want to fade out my shadows about at those points, or well before those points, really. And at these parts where it's really deeper, like you can actually bring in slightly darker colors as well. Bring in some of these darker browns on the on the book cover over here. I keep calling it the binding. And then that's pretty much it for the darker colors and the medium colors. And the next step is going to be the doing some highlights on the leather. Now there's a few different ways you can do this. If you have any skin brushes, and if you happen to have like a freckle brush or something like that, those work pretty well for leather texture. I'm going to color sample where I'm at. I'm going to move it slightly closer to yellow, just a little bit, and make it a little bit brighter. And you see, if we brush in a bunch of these, you can start to see that it makes a kind of leather texture. However, if you don't have a freckle brush or a leather texture brush or anything like that, we'll just go back with the painting brush that we've been using, the little pencil brush that I have. And I'm going to show you a trick. Make sure that you have your opacity and your flow connected to your pressure sensitivity. And we're going to make it a pretty small brush. And here's what you do. You just move around, making little kind of wild figure 8 movements. And you overlap and you twist them and all of this stuff. And what happens is that if you, just like with pointillism, if you focus a lot of them in one area, and then you gradually sort of fade them out into another, you end up creating a kind of texture. And so I'm thinking like I want the highlight to be up here in the top left corner of the book cover. And you know, I'm easing my pressure, and I'm easing like the compressedness of it. Like I'm doing a lot more of them a lot closer together over here with more pressure on the pen. And out here I'm spacing them out more, and I'm not putting as much pressure. And that's one way to do it. And if it looks too wiry or like, you know, it might look like a carpet or hair or something like that, then you can actually come back in with your darker color and just do a little bit of that on top of it to kind of break it up. Just some wild movement and just something to destroy that continuity of the all the lines that you just made. And because sometimes even with leather, you'll see like long straight lines in it from the skin patterns and stuff. And so that's one way you can do it as well. And if we zoom back a little bit, like you can really see that is starting to take shape with the texture. And I'll do the rest of it in that same method, and maybe even come in with a slightly lighter highlight. We'll go into time lapse while I finish this up. And I'm going to go into time lapse a little bit longer, and I'm only working on the leather part right now. I'm not touching the metal or the pages, and all I'm doing is just bringing the shadows a little bit deeper and the highlights just ever so slightly brighter. I use a mixture of just straight painting it onto the canvas, as well as taking a darker red orangish color and using it on a layer that's set to linear dodge as its blend mode. And I'll come out of time lapse when I do that and show you what it does. Okay, so now I've pulled the shadows a little bit deeper and I'm happy with how they're looking, but I want to bring the highlights out a little bit more. And I'm going to do this pretty much over the whole book, even though we haven't painted the pages or the metal bits yet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to set it to clipping mask. So that's, again, you hold the Alt key, click on the line in between the layer. They have to be next to each other. And you'll see this little arrow and box pop up right over here. And if you click that, you'll notice that the layer gets indented and it has an arrow pointing at the layer below it. Now what that means, again, is if you're drawing on top of this layer, it is only going to draw on the areas where the layer beneath it is. It will not draw in anything that is transparent. So now I'm going to take this new layer that we have. I'm going to set its blend mode to linear dodge add. If you don't have linear dodge add, it might be just called linear dodge, it might be just called add, or you may not have it. It just depends on what software you're working with. But what I like to do is I take this kind of layer and I take a very dark reddish orange color and I get a really large soft brush, like almost as big as the book itself. But I want you to watch what this does. See, like this allows me to just kind of brush on some sunlight almost. Like if I push really hard, you can see it's actually quite bright. But if I do just a little bit, it gives us some light kind of coming from one direction. And it also adds to our color variations, like in the whole piece. Now I'm actually going to use an eraser with that soft brush and lighten this up just a little bit because I want to have a bigger range. I don't want to have it all super bright or all super dark. Another thing that I'm going to do is because what I'm simulating that light coming down onto the book. So I'm going to take my eraser. I'm going to use my painting brush again that I had, and I'm going to erase the little edges of this that light wouldn't touch. And you'll see kind of what this does here. It's just little things. It's not a major effect that it has. But basically everything underneath here, it's not going to touch. It's only going to touch that top portion of the book. make sure I'm getting all of this over here on the pages. We'll get a little bit on the top of the strap here. We won't get any on the pages here. And that's more what I'm looking for. And again, so you can see the difference of what that actually has done. I'm going to turn it off so you can see it. And it really kind of brings it to life. It gives it a little bit of sunlight shown on it. And so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take that layer and I'm going to merge that with our painting layer. And I'm going to call the leather part done. I'm not going to mess with it anymore. I may add some slight highlights on the binding and stuff later. But now we're going to do the pages real quickly, and then we'll focus on the metal. All I need is a small pencil brush again. We're going to select that lighter color, maybe even go just slightly lighter, and I'm going to scrape in some page edges just here and there on the binding of the book. I'm not even going to really like paint any extra things onto it. I'm going to start just kind of bringing this in, and these dark areas don't really need to be that dark, so I'm going to work on knocking those down just a little bit with a lighter color. And we'll get that lighter color back, do some more pages. And it's pretty amazing what just a few lines can do, because as I said, you don't need to do every single page to get the effect that you're wanting. I'm going to rotate the canvas just a little bit, and we'll do the same thing on this bottom edge. We'll bring it back. Okay, and that's pretty much all I'm going to do for the page. We might, let's see, if we brighten this up, I think that might help a little. Yeah, I like that. That works pretty well. That's pretty much it for the pages and for the leather. Now we're going to start working on the metal. And this one, if you haven't done a lot of metal, you may want to work on a new layer on this one, just in case you don't like what happens. Or just duplicate what you're working on and work on it that way. So I think we're going to start on the lock. We're going to establish the colors that we're going to need. We're going to establish the shadows and everything else. We're going to use the same brush that we've been using. I'm going to color sample that. I'm going to bring it pretty dark and get a small brush because we need some sharp edges for this. And we're going to fill in the keyhole portion. And you may notice from time to time that the drawing goes into time lapse, and that's mostly just to save you some time where you don't have to sit and watch me do every single little stroke on this. So I'm going around. I've filled in the center of the keyhole. I'm going around the edges of the metal that are pointed away from the light, and I'm just giving it a slight outline. Not even really an outline, but just a more defined edge. We'll do the same thing with the highlights, but on the other side. So what I'll do here is I'm going to color sample this, and we're going to come around and do the same thing here. I don't want to go brighter just yet because I'm still kind of establishing the shape. And we can always add in some brighter highlights where we need them. Okay, now there's a little bit of an overlap of the leather color here. I'm just going to color sample that and just blend that right on out. A little bit of a edge is okay, but we don't want as much as was there. The next step would be to smooth out these lines that are in here. You can do that a couple different ways. We've done it already with a softer brush. You can do it by using that same painting brush just with soft strokes. and just color sampling as you're kind of going along. That's another way to do it. You can get fairly, you can have a nice blend but still keep that sort of painterly look to it. And another way that you can do it in digital is if you have a smudge tool. You can get your smudge tool out and you can just smudge it around. Or a blur tool even, you can do it that way too. They work pretty similarly. Of course they're going to behave differently depending on how powerful you have them to be. But I'm going to go ahead and just smudge out the rest of these while we have that tool open. We'll do the shadows and highlights and stuff in just a moment, but I want to go ahead and just smooth things out. There we go. Okay, now we're going to come back to the middle here. So the next step is I need to think about, do I need more shadow? And I do need a little bit more. So I'm going to choose this center color again for the keyhole that we had. And I go back to a small brush. And this little divot in between these sections, remember, because in the first video, we made it where if this were real, these two pieces would come apart when whoever unlocked the spellbook unlocked it. And so there would be a natural little crease in between those two pieces. The next part, we're going to go slightly lighter and a little bit larger of a brush. And I'm going to come on the top edge of this dark portion here. And I'm just going to lay in a little bit of that. And then I'm going to very lightly try to fade that down pretty quickly. Like I don't want those shadows to extend very far. I may even take a lighter color and kind of blend up into it a little bit, like so. And that's pretty close to how we need that to be. Because if you look at shiny metals, you get some pretty deep shadows as well as some pretty bright highlights. Speaking of highlights, we're going to do those next. We're going to sample this color here. It's still pretty orange. We're going to move it slightly more yellow and a little bit brighter. And start here and just kind of fade it upward into that orange color that we had. And then I'm going to take a smaller brush and I'm going to use that lighter yellow that we're using and bring out some more extreme highlights on the areas that I feel like would be more highlighted. And if you're not sure about this, I always recommend using a reference if you can find a good one. Just look at metal pieces and you can kind of start to figure out, like, you know, more or less how light plays around with it. We'll do the same thing on the edge up top here. And then finally, after doing all this, you'll take almost a white color and just, I'm not pushing it all the way on everywhere. I'm just putting some very light highlights. I might put an all the way white highlight on a couple of spots. Pretty much leave it at that, because if you do too many of them, it makes them less impressive and less effective. Because if every little spot has highlights that just get to white to white to white, you know, they're not going to look the way that you want them to. Another thing to keep in mind is that your edges are going to catch a lot of light. And that's pretty much it for the buckle there. So I'm going to go through back into time lapse. I'm going to finish up the metal and then we'll come back and talk. All right, and so here, you know, we've got our finished spellbook. You can do other things, like you could go on and you could add engraving into the leather. You could add like glowing glyphs or something like that, or you could just leave it a plain leather book with the brass bindings and brass lock on it the way that it is here. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you followed along. If you have any questions at all, please leave me a comment down below, and if there was something that I didn't cover or a question that you may have, I'm happy to take the time to answer you. I do want to thank you, and thank you for taking the time to hang out here and watch this video, and hopefully you watch the one before it. If not, I'll link that here. Please, if you did follow along and you did draw your own version of a leather-bound book or a spell book or something cool, and you want to share it online, post it on Twitter or Instagram, please tag me. I'd love to see it. I've also got an amazing interactive community on Gilded, full of creative people. It's got places where you can post and share your artwork, comment on each other's work. You can request critiques and things like that. But anyhow, thank you again so much for being here. I appreciate you. And a quick shout out to all of my patrons over on my Art by Galen Patreon and my Elucid Patreon. Thank you guys so much for your support. And I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.